in the United States are becoming a battleground instead of a civic activity. That's why we have today's topic as part of a 3-briefing series that we started last week when we looked at a constitutional crisis. And this week we're going to look to the threats over the 2024 U.S. elections and wonder if we are prepared to face them. The big lie that the Democrats stole the 2020 election continues to be believed by a large majority of the Republican Party and possibly other people. The big lie continues to be projected by Trump and others in 2024, increasing the chance that many believe that violence during and around elections is justified. What about if, in the coming year, candidates of one party declare victory over the protests of election administrators? Maybe candidates will declare fraud even before elections are held or after with no evidence. What about if election officials are threatened or harmed? Those threats have already happened. But maybe some other officials will refuse to count election results if they are loyal to a certain candidate. What if disinformation that occurred in 2020, and we do remember it was a big deal back then, it's even more pernicious this coming year, due to the use of artificial intelligence and things like deep fakes, and we will have some of those explained. What about if we see violent protests, some may encourage before, during, or after the presidential elections? Again, we also saw that in 2016 and 2017. In 2020 and 2021. But we may have reason to believe they might be harder to confront this coming year. Our speakers include Gowri Ramachandran, Deputy Director of the Elections and Government Program at the Brennan Center for Justice; Nora Benavidez, Senior Counsel and Director of Digital Justice and Civil Rights at Free Press, FP; William Adler, Associate Director of the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center; and Sam Gregory, Executive Director of Witness.org. We ask speakers to speak slowly, as I'm doing, for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean, and we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat. Our speakers are also encouraged to answer questions in the chat if they are able to. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later today, including the panelists. And now I'm going to welcome our first speaker. Welcome to our briefing, Gowri Ramachandran from the Brennan Center for Justice. It's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much for doing this briefing on these very important topics. Today, I wanted to talk about some of the things that the Brennan Center is advising local election officials to do as we head into 2024 in the face of all of these threats that Pilar has mentioned. One of the things we're doing is we're really advising election officials to double down on some of the same things we have advised election officials to do over the years. So first, to double down on their efforts to bolster the security and the resilience of election infrastructure to avoid any disruptions to voter access. Those can occur when there are problems with election equipment, poll worker shortages, issues with the voter registration database. And what that means is that election officials should engage in practices that help them detect and recover from those disruptions. So things like touchscreen vote machines breaking down, or electronic poll books becoming unusable, or a breach of the voter registration database that they administer. So we've long recommended practices such as backing up the registration database well before the election, having plenty of emergency and provisional paper ballot supplies on hand, so that way if there are machine issues, lines can keep moving, doing capacity testing for the systems that poll workers rely on to keep the lines moving. So things like networked electronic poll books, they can test the capacity make sure that even if there's really high voter turnout, those systems will keep functioning smoothly. And so we've recommended these practices in the past, and of course, we continue to recommend them going into 2024. And it's partly because when you have some of these kind of disruptions, small things going wrong during an election, maybe a long line at one polling place and not at another, it can actually really lead to and provide the fodder for a lot of disinformation about the whole election being sort of unfair, even if these are isolated incidents. So having those resiliency practices in place, not letting small technical difficulties or disruptions turn into, a bigger problem is a really good way for election officials to secure the election, both against these disruptions to voter access, but also as against any kind of nefarious attempts to take advantage of that and, make it into more than it is. Another security threat going into 2024 that we're concerned about is election worker shortages. Actually, we saw poll worker shortages during the pandemic in 2020, often caused by folks, especially elderly people who often used to volunteer as poll workers or sign up as poll workers. Obviously, folks felt that it was risky to provide that service during the pandemic before vaccinations were available. But you can also get poll worker shortages when election workers feel unsafe due to threats and harassment. So that's why we're recommending that states and election officials take action to show election workers that they're protected, their safety is a priority. So a number of states have passed laws prohibiting the doxing of election workers or allowing them to enroll in address confidentiality programs. That's a great step. Another thing that election officials can do to help their poll workers feel safe is they can request a free physical security assessment of their offices from CISA, which is the federal government's cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency. So they can get that free assessment and then use that assessment to request upgrades to their offices. So things like bulletproof glass, key card access, those sort of things. State and local law enforcement should also really make clear to the public that threats against election workers will not be tolerated. So we're seeing an example of that in Georgia right now, actually. The Fulton County District Attorney has included in the indictment of alleged co-conspirators around the 2020 election. She has included some folks who allegedly threatened election workers. So that is helping the public understand that you can be held accountable criminally if you threaten election workers. Another thing law enforcement can do is reach out and form connections in advance of the election with local election officials to determine what their needs are and how to be helpful without, maybe engaging in any kind of inadvertent intimidation of voters. One final threat I want to talk about to the election is disinformation, which I've touched on before. That can disrupt voting if voters become confused about how they should register or exercise their rights. And so as part of our security recommendations, we are recommending that election officials really do their part to promote accurate information to voters, including in the languages and through the media channels that their voters and their communities use. So promoting that accurate information, reaching out to media in multiple languages, it really helps to pre-bunk any disinformation that might be targeted at the communities that election officials are serving. Now, I know we've heard a lot about artificial intelligence potentially amplifying this disinformation threat and making it even worse in 2024. And it is true that artificial intelligence can make it easier and cheaper for non-professionals to create fake media, fake emails, fake websites, including deep fakes. It can also make it easier to automate these fraudulent products so that there's more of them while still being very difficult to identify. But fortunately, a lot of the same things that election officials have had recommended to them in the past to combat this kind of fake information can still work as against artificial intelligence. So things like using a .gov domain for their website and email makes it harder for an imposter website or an imposter email to trick members of the public. That's one thing that, again, CISA, that federal agency, can help election officials with doing for free. Also using things like multi-factor authentication for all of their logins, all of their staff to election systems. That can help build resilience. Even if some worker does get tricked by some AI-powered phishing email and they end up providing a password to a malicious actor, you still have that multi-factor authentication as a backup. So really, we're recommending that folks just double down and invest even more in all the very good security practices that officials across the state have been engaged in.
Unmute. I always mute because I don't want any noise here to get into the briefing. Thank you, Gowri. A couple questions. We have time for a couple of questions. So some areas in California are shifting to hand ballots, building on claims that the electronic voting systems are corrupt. How widespread is that? And is it problematic?
That's a great question. One thing I want to clarify is that this movement to shift is a movement towards hand counting of ballots. It's not really a movement towards hand marked paper ballots, because many parts of the country already use those. And in fact, voters who vote by mail are typically hand marking a paper ballot at home, at their kitchen table. So we've already got a very widespread practice in this country of paper ballots. Even voters who use a touchscreen machine in many parts of the country, there's a paper backup printed out of their choices, and they can check it and make sure it represents their choices before they cast the ballot. So this isn't a movement to move to paper ballots. This is a movement towards hand counting all the ballots. It's very misguided movement, because unless you're in a very small jurisdiction, maybe 1,000 or fewer voters, and you have a very short ballot with not a lot of candidates on there or a lot of ballot initiatives on there, unless you're in that unusual situation, it's extremely time consuming and expensive and error prone to hand count ballots. Sometimes there's a time and a place for hand counting. Like, let's say there's a extremely close contest at just a few votes apart, and you need to make sure that every single ballot was scanned accurately, and you have to do that human hand-eye comparison. Or if you're performing an audit of just one contest, let's say, it's a lot less energy and labor to hand count a single contest than to do everything on the ballot. I'm in California, our ballots are pages and pages long. Hand counting all of that would take a long time. And so it's a very misguided movement. In terms of how widespread it is, there are a number of counties across the country that have considered in some shape or form buying into these conspiracy theories and making this misguided move. It hasn't really gone. Many counties have sort of pulled back from it, essentially, once they start looking into the cost. Often their local election official will tell them, I've created a cost estimate. Here's all the reasons this is a problem. And many counties have wisely pulled back from going down this path. But there are a few places that, unfortunately, these conspiracy theories are really stubborn, like Shasta County in California that you've mentioned, Pilar.
Yeah. Henrietta Burrows has a question. Please answer it as quick as you can, because we need to go to the next speaker in about 3 minutes. So Henrietta?
Yes, thanks, Pilar. It takes manpower and resources to take all of those protections. And since states have their own election controls, well, they all have the same capabilities to take all of those protective measures. And I'd like to add to that, will all election officials be so motivated? Because some were accused, for example, in Georgia, of being partisan. So how can one ensure that election officials will be nonpartisan?
That's a great question. I'll take the first half of it very quickly. The Brennan Center definitely supports consistent and adequate funding for elections, because you're right, all of this takes a lot of resources, and elections are just often really underfunded and not properly prioritized. from both state and the federal government. So improvement in those resources would really go a long way to helping people actually take these recommended measures. In terms of election officials who themselves might have bought into some of these conspiracy theories or have kind of partisan aims, I'll refer to that prosecution or that indictment in Fulton County, Georgia. Again, actually, we're seeing there, and it's not the only instance where election officials who sort of gave improper access to partisan nefarious actors are now being prosecuted in Fulton County, or who allegedly gave that access. They're now being prosecuted. This has happened in some other states as well. So I would really just point to the fact that giving that improper illegal access can often violate the law, and people can be held accountable if they try to do that.
Okay, maybe we'll I think there was another part of the question, but we'll leave that. I was just gonna say people being held accountable may not happen if Trump is president, but let's move on with a more hopeful presentation. I welcome Nora Benavidez. She's Senior Counsel and Director of Digital Justice and Civil Rights at Free Press. Nora, welcome. Bienvenida.
Thank you so much, Pilar. It's good to be here with everyone, though I'm not sure I can offer a more hopeful prospect on the social media front. I figured I would talk a little bit about the climate right now on social media platforms, what we anticipate as the threats in the next year, 12 months, even through the next 15 months, and then recommendations for social media platforms and for journalists in this climate. So thanks so much for having me. I think these are really important avenues for reporters and for media to engage in. I also just want to commend all of you for thinking so far ahead. One of the biggest flaws with social media companies when it comes to elections is the way that they spin up their election integrity efforts just a few months before an election in any given region. And that's really never soon enough. It's often far too late. So to give you some context, I guess I'll take it back to some of the acceptances that tech companies made following the insurrection on January 6th here in the United States. The biggest tech companies, Meta, TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, Google's search engine and their parent company Alphabet, finally seem to accept in some ways that their failure to moderate content somehow played a role in undermining public safety and democracy. We saw the role that social media played in the lead up and surrounding the attempted coup in Brazil as well. And over the last 6 weeks, we have seen social media become even more toxic and chaotic amid the conflict in the Middle East regarding Israel and Gaza. Twitter is a uniquely bad situation, and I could spend hours talking about what has happened. So I'll really just summarize some of what we've seen over the last years, and certainly once Elon Musk purchased Twitter. Twitter has, I think, I call it a grand failure, because while the other major social media companies have somehow deprioritized platform integrity with real world impact, Twitter is just really uniquely bad. Elon Musk has removed all accountability. He removed his board of directors, the Trust and Safety Council, most of his trust and safety team. He removed most of the people who are part of the ethical engineering and AI teams. He cut contractors who were tasked with moderating content. And that's just in the first month. He then moved on to adapt a lot of design features. The biggest change was the blue checkmark status, which many of you may have enjoyed previously. It was one of the best hallmarks of authenticity and helped build trust on Twitter. It has now become a monthly subscription service. And if you are willing to pay $8, the content from your account gets boosted for other people's feeds. That feature has become a vulnerability that bad actors are exploiting by purchasing these accounts, Their content often, at least in the last 6 weeks, has contained some of the most graphic, violent, misleading disinformation and just horrific imagery and content regarding Israel and Palestinian issues. But played out over other crises, Twitter has failed, and many of the other companies have as well. Over the last year, Meta, Twitter, and YouTube have all laid off thousands of trust and safety workers and content moderators, which kind of points to where their values lie, because amid all of the thousands of layoffs, they're really deprioritizing the health of the content on their platforms. And we are always in the tech accountability space in this position of having to somehow legitimize that the online world has offline consequence. I think there's just a growing body of evidence that this is real. Even in mainstream media, we have seen news outlets like CNN and the LA Times digest misinformation and disinformation originating on social media. And they've turned some of those stories, little did they know from their lack of verification that they were false, they've now had to retract or correct stories that were poorly vetted, which originated on social media. So there is a very porous relationship between what happens on the social media side, how it moves towards and gets embedded within our traditional media outlets and mainstream media. And that will have grave implications as we look towards the next 12 to 15 months. I'll sort of turn to some of the recommendations that I've been thinking about and working with other coalitions on. When it comes to the platform integrity protections that companies should have in place, there are really 6 things that companies should be doing. 1, platforms should reinvest and bolster the staffing of teams needed to safeguard election integrity and trust and safety and moderation. Just to give you a couple of numbers, at least 2 of the major companies have rolled back and discontinued moderating big lie content. 2 of the companies have discontinued moderating COVID-related disinformation. All of these major companies, Meta, Twitter, and YouTube, have relaxed their political ads policies, which will allow any number of nefarious state actors and other third-party actors to somehow weaponize those political ads, leaving room for users to see content that may contain falsities or other hate, misleading information about polling locations or candidates, untold amounts of information. So all of the companies need to reinstate the proactive and protective policies that previously moderated election-related content. This includes just better labeling, the various disinformation policies they had in place, and more. They also should be launching 2024 specific election interventions in time for the US primaries. That means that they need to have protections in place by at least February of 2024 and keep those protections in place for the next year. The threat of insurrection or other infiltration is not just most acute during an election week. We know that there are threats that may occur at various moments leading up to and surrounding election certification process. So these various interventions on platforms have to be kept in place even after the election through inauguration. One of the major ways that people like Donald Trump, other leaders can exploit vulnerabilities on these platforms is because they are given special treatment. They are not held to the same standard as others because the platforms say people have an outsized interest in what people like Donald Trump say. I believe that we need to hold VIP special accounts to the same enforcement standards applied to other users. We also need more efficient review and enforcement of political ads across languages. We cannot have moderators looking at political ads in translation. We need those in English and in languages where the content originated. And then finally, we need to develop improved transparency and disclosure practices. I know we don't get to talk a lot here about the downstream harms to users, but there's so much that happens that we don't actually know about on these companies' platforms and services. So we need core metrics data shared with external researchers, journalists like you, lawmakers, and others. That includes virality reports, network analysis reports, and more. So I'll close by just giving you a couple of comments about reporters in the media. What do you do with all of this? People are going to be hungry for credible information. During any democratic electoral period, people will also likely use social media more than any other service or information pathway. And so one of the most important things is to meet voters where they are. You have to be online in some form. You have to be able to ask questions of voters to understand what information they want. And don't wait to cover stories a week before a voter registration deadline. Cover stories now. Given that you're here, I feel like you are probably already there. In your actual reporting, focus on the process of voting for people, the mechanics, the deadlines, the fact that we will likely not get our election results on election night. And then debunk misinformation and disinformation for readers. You are probably one of the more trusted people that readers look to, you individually, each of you. And so you have this outsized power to influence and help encourage people to practice better media literacy themselves. And then my last recommendation is what I often call report denominators. There's so much frenzy around election periods. And when a given story, which might be real, is reported about an election, a local election being rigged, or some kind of ballot box breaking down technologically, please share with readers what that looks like. Is that 3 out of 10 issues that you are seeing, or is it 3 out of 100,000? When we cover isolated incidents, whether they are one-off election errors or demonstrations in a city, you have to be clear about whether they seem indicative of larger trends. People will be so vulnerable to the stories they read, and they will then tell their own version of that. And so you want to be very clear for readers to understand the scale of what is happening in the months leading up to and following an election. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll put my email in the chat for anyone that's interested.
Thank you, Nora. Well, unfortunately, anecdotal journalism has, became the rule years ago when the internet appeared and people wanted clicks. But anyway, there is a question by Seema Gupta. Seema, I think that's a very important question. Can you ask that question? And we only have a couple minutes. Okay, I'm going to ask the question. Why is it that there is no regulations or less regulations for the tech companies here in the US like they have in Europe? It seems to be helping there.
Well, we are still waiting to see what the Digital Service Act, which is the regulation in the EU, ultimately looks like when it is implemented. We're just beginning to get reports of what compliance may look like. For every violation of the DSA, a company will have to pay about 6% of its annual revenue. That's actually a lot of money. I think about Elon Musk and Twitter, and that's a lot of money for every violation of the DSA. Here in the United States, we are actively pushing for 2 things. And I know we're tight on time, so I'll talk more in the chat with you about it. But one is limits on what data can be collected about each of us. With massive amounts of data collected, the platforms themselves can use that data to curate our feeds for different people, giving them different experiences. Often that has discriminatory impacts. And as sort of on the attorney side, I work a lot on that regulatory and lawmaking process. And then the other thing that's happening is the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is currently working on a rulemaking to create the rules for consumer protection that would limit what companies can do with our data and how they surveil us. These are not going to fix everything, but these are initial stopgaps in the lead up to 2024 that we need. So we're working on all of these now. I'm very hopeful that we'll see at least one before the 2024 elections.
Okay, we got to the hope. Perfect. Thank you, Nora. All right, we are right on time. But now we go to William Adler from the Bipartisan Policy Center. William, such an honor to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting me, and thank you for having this briefing. And also such fantastic commentary from Gowri and Nora. I really appreciate hearing from you guys, and a lot of what I have to say is going to echo what they've said already. But today we are about 2 months away from the Iowa caucuses. That's not very far at all, and we're about 2.5 months away from the first presidential primary in New Hampshire. So election season is very much about to get into full swing. So we at the Bipartisan Policy Center focus on achieving durable policy solutions to problems facing the American election system. And the way that we do that is we tried to lead with the concerns of election officials, and we have a number of task forces of bipartisan election officials across the country. This helps us stay on top of the top concerns about elections from the people who know them best, those who are on the ground administering them. So we tend to lead with the recommendations that they have, the things that they think that they need. So last week,
Slow down a bit for the interpreter.
yes,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I wrote that down to talk slowly, but it doesn't mean I can actually put it into practice. Thank you. So last week we wrote a blog post highlighting a few of those top threats. And these are things that fall into the category of the nuts and bolts of election administration, how the ballots are collected and counted, some of the workforce issues that Gowri touched on. And all of this plays into the information environment around this stuff, which Nora touched on. Many of these things that I'm going to talk about are things that journalists covering the election, I think, should be well aware of. So some of the things aren't going to be news to the veteran election reporters in this room, but they're still absolutely worth flagging. So I'll start with one, which is election official turnover, which Gowri also talked about. Gowri talked about some of the policy solutions to this, which we're also focused on. But for the purposes of the reporters here, I just want to give a little bit more context, things to be looking for when you all are reporting on the election. One thing is that administering elections has always been difficult. It's always been a relatively thankless, low-paid government job. Over the past 20 years, it's gotten increasingly complex. As we've incorporated technology more into the processes, election officials have, in a way, become IT managers, which is not something that the job has always consisted of. And since 2020, they've really been in the public spotlight. They've faced public threats. That's come with new responsibilities in terms of how they communicate about their work. Very few election offices even have a person dedicated to communications, even though every local election official realizes and that this is now a key part of their job that it just wasn't before even 2020 or 2016. And this has translated to turnover. So there's a new survey out of Reed College that was published yesterday of about 1,000 local election officials. And just some top line stats from that, 31% of the local election officials surveyed in that know of local election officials who left their jobs because of personal safety issues and threats. 11% of those surveyed have considered leaving because of safety concerns. And over a third of them are going to be eligible for retirement before 2026. The Brennan Center has also done some polling on this and also found some similarly alarming numbers. And you can kind of think of this is all part of a very dangerous cycle, right? Election officials face threats. They may be more inclined to leave their jobs. That results in less institutional knowledge on how to run an election, which might result in more mistakes. And mistakes do happen in elections. They happen in every single election. And that may in turn undermine voter confidence, which brings more threats and attention, and the cycle begins anew. And misinformation is a huge piece of that. And again, this Reed survey that came out yesterday showed that misinformation was one of the top 3 concerns for all the election officials surveyed. So it's not really, misinformation is not really like a separate threat from all of the other things that we've talked about in elections. It's the thing that hangs over these, right? When things go wrong in elections or just are perceived to have gone wrong, that feeds misinformation. So, for purposes of your coverage, things that I would just make sure that you know are that mistakes do happen every election. It's possible that they may be worse in 2024 because of this loss of institutional knowledge, but mistakes, while they're often really alarming as they're being reported in the initial minutes and hours, it almost always ends up being the case after some investigation, that they're the result of absolutely mundane data entry errors and things like that. This is actually what happened last week. Last week there was an error in some voting in Pennsylvania, and it was just a basic data entry error that is unlikely to affect any results. And election procedures are designed to be resilient to error. There are lots of checks along the way. There's lots of redundancy, and these are almost all ultimately fixed pretty easily. There are some reasons for hope here, since you're looking for those, Pilar. One is that there's reason to believe that the turnover statistics don't reflect the experience level of incoming election officials. The field has been a little bit more professionalized in the last 10 years than it was before, which means there are training programs that election officials can take as they're becoming election officials. So there's some reason to believe that as some people retire for whatever reason, either because they've reached retirement age or because of the threats, there's reason to believe that the incoming election officials might actually have more experience and be a little bit more educated than the people they're replacing were when they first started their job. So we think state and local election officials are really rising to meet the moment, even under these difficult conditions. And then lastly, I just want to again reiterate what both Gowri and Nora talked about, which is the period after voting ends where we're waiting for the results. We all have the experience of waiting impatiently after an election. It makes sense. We all want to know the results. But this is when misinformation can spread, right? I'm sure we can all remember the few days after Election Day in 2020 when there was round-the-clock cable news coverage of the countings. And there's this huge mismatch between the levels of public attention on the results and the slow trickle of information about the process, which creates, this hunger for information, for a narrative. It creates a void, and misinformation peddlers are all too eager to fill it. This was a big deal in 2020, and there's plenty of reason to believe that it will be the same in 2024. In 2020, because of COVID, there was this big rise in the use of absentee ballots. There were long delays in processing those ballots. There were, in some cases, deadlines, that allowed absentee ballots to come in pretty late. There's lots of factors for when a state might be called by the media. And that is when a state, the results are known. It's when it's called by the media. And the factors there are the closeness of the race, the number of absentee ballots in a state, the absentee deadlines, and the rules about whether the election officials are allowed to start processing or counting ballots before Election Day. And there's been some change in the landscape there with regards to the rules, but there are still absolutely key states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan where they're not allowed to start processing the ballots ahead of Election Day, or not allowed to do it fully. So I'll kind of wind down there, but just as a closing note, I'll just say, we're all doing our best to anticipate the threats coming down the pike in 2024 and, what the key narratives will be. But of course, take this all with a grain of salt, because if we were doing this exercise in 2019, none of us would have known about COVID. None of us would have known about the fact that the whole world, not the whole world, but everybody in the country was going to start thinking about what absentee ballots are. Absentee ballots were not new, but they were certainly new to most voters at that time. So, it's hard to anticipate what the exact threats will be. And I'll just say to, educate yourself on the specifics of the process in the jurisdictions that you cover. The devil is in the details. Is it paper? How are the machines tested? How are the ballots counted? Will there be a post-election audit? If you learn these details in advance, you'll be better equipped to understand when some new unanticipated thing goes wrong and be able to report accurately. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Will. Some questions have been answered in the chat, and I'm going to hold on to some other questions in the interest of time to go to our fourth speaker, and then we'll take all the questions that we can. Okay. So I'm inviting Sam Gregory from witness.org. Sam, welcome.
Thanks, Pilar, and thank you for the invitation to be here. So I'm not an expert on elections, so I'm going to focus on talking broadly about what we know now about deepfakes and AI, what we can predict might happen in the next year, and then what are the responses from, particularly for journalists, and what is available to you, and how does that fit within a broader legislative landscape that might be also shaping it. So some technical shifts, like I think it's important for folks to know, and I'm going to assume some level of familiarity, but perhaps a range of familiarity on the call, so bear with me. I spent a lot of the last 5 years encouraging people not to hype the fears of particularly deepfakes and generative AI, because often our fears have exceeded the reality. Our fears of the ability, for example, to do very convincing face swap deepfakes where you take someone's face or you manipulate them have generally been out of proportion to the technical capacity to do that, and particularly the technical capacity to do that in a range of settings and complex real-life settings. What's changed in the last year, and I think it's where journalists and others need to be thinking, is you're seeing a lot of increased ease in two areas. You're seeing increased ease that is around image generation, and of course that's because you can now do that in pretty much any tool, right? You can generate an image from a text prompt that is trivially simple for almost anyone to do at this point. So image generation has got a lot easier to do, both in terms of single images, but also a volume of images and a volume of variants of an image. And then the second one is audio, and I'm going to talk more about threats in a moment that we've seen over the past months and are likely to see. So audio has also improved a lot in the last year, both in accessibility, but also in ease of production. So there are a range of commercial tools that you can either use a free version of or potentially access in another way that allow you to input a certain amount of audio and then be able to create a mimic voice from text or similar. So those two have improved. The third, which has been used in some of the disinformation context and election context globally, is it's also relatively easy to create a synthetic avatar of someone who looks like a human and can be animated to do some kind of behavior. It still remains relatively hard to do like real life animated videos in real world circumstances, which I think is a lot of what people jump to when they make assumptions in this area. So as journalists, sort of starting from a baseline of what actually is possible versus what the narrative is about this, I think is helpful. The second thing I want to talk about is kind of what we're seeing in terms of the misuse of those tools and how they impact in particularly political and electoral context. So, you know, the first thing to know is, and this has been consistently the case around deepfakes since 2018, is they are used to target women and to some extent other gender identities with non-consensual sexual deepfakes. And of course, this is threatening both because it can target people who are in public life and in private life, and sometimes you're not aware that it's happening. So, you know, it's very important that journalists be aware that this threat is there. It is being deployed. You're seeing more coverage on it. And it is trivially easy to do. That is not a complicated thing to do, but it's commoditized. You can just pay someone to do it for you for very little money. So that's a threat that is both one that, you know, can have political implications, also has very significant implications for pushing people out of the public sphere. And in conversations I've had with people working in electoral processes, this is something they've seen and also are worried about because it builds on existing patterns. The second thing I would say is we're definitely seeing global patterns around image generation. Israel-Gaza conflict is, you know, obviously a place where you're seeing some patterns happening as well as in other elections globally. So there you're seeing people sharing meme generation, right? This has made meme generation even easier, right? If you want to generate memes, it has also made it easier for people to generate somewhat realistic looking images that they can share, usually to incite their own side, right? They're not convincing to the other side, so to speak, but they are, you know, and they can be convincing, right? And I'm going to come to like the questions of detection in a moment. So you have image generation is trivially easy, as I say, and is being deployed in a wide range of contexts. And again, what I should note is, of course, there's a range of actors in these types of scenarios. There's official campaigns, there are proxies, there are other actors, and there are disinformation actors. And we're seeing those images occurring actually pretty much across the range. If you look globally, right, you have political campaigns, obviously in the US using them in political ads. You have them in other countries where they're being deployed with even greater frequency. For example, Argentina. Second area is audio. There is a spate of deceptive audios that have been used in electoral context. I think we should anticipate it in the US next year. Just to give you some examples, use of a deceptive audio to impugn the reputation of one of the two leading political leaders in Slovakia in the EU, one targeting the UK Labour leader, one targeting one of the prime politicians in Mexico, right? There's enough evidence there to tell you that you probably need to worry about that given its deployment. We have seen it in the US in some contexts. There was deceptive audio of a mayoral candidate in Chicago. So as you're looking at it, you should be thinking about deceptive images and deceptive audio and non-consensual sexual deepfakes. The other thing that is very prevalent and is occurring globally, and we talk to journalists globally who are grappling with this, is kind of isn't it cases where someone is claiming something real is deepfaked when it's actually real. We run a program where we receive a lot of cases of deepfakes, and a lot of them are actually people trying to deny a piece of audio on the basis that it has been faked, and basically relying on people's absence of knowledge to use that. So we should anticipate isn't it claims in the coming election that are going to be prominent. And then the fifth thing I would say, just as a note, is that obviously also we should be thinking about people who are treading the fine line between satirical content and disinformation, gaslighting. We see that in a number of contexts already. It's particularly easy with photorealistic and audio realistic content to do that, right, intentionally or perhaps sometimes accidentally as misinformation. So in terms of solutions and what you should be thinking about, there are a range of technical solutions. There are a range of legislative possibilities happening now. Legislatively, I'm not overly optimistic that there will be a whole set of US federal or state legislation addressing this. A couple of places you should keep an eye out because it might impact you depending where you're located and possibly depending on the speed of federal lawmaking or rulemaking. You have potentially legislation on non-consensual sexual deepfakes, making it harder for people to use those. You have a set of legislation around labeling political ads and labeling AI-generated content, and you have some potential rulemaking or clarification of rules in the Federal Election Commission around political ads and fraudulent representation. So we may see those by next year. Some of those we will see, but not necessarily all of them. The other areas that I think have become particularly important for journalists who are trying to do their work in this area is to think about, well, what's available to me, right, when I'm in the middle of a story like this, trying to challenge it or to understand it. I have to say this is not a great scenario for journalists if you're looking for technical solutions right now. There are, broadly speaking, two sets of technical solutions. There are approaches that are about either enforcing or requiring or allowing people to place indicators in media that's AI generated. So essentially you can look at a piece of media and see that it was generated with AI, either because people have been obliged to put that signal in, or they have chosen to do that, or have chosen to add a signal to a piece of media to show that it's authentic. And there's quite a lot of movement in that's happening. It's, in fact, if you generate, for example, a tool with Adobe or Microsoft with one of their generic tools, it will do that. It'll add this signal. The problem is that malicious actors are unlikely to use that, and it's not widely available yet. The second set of questions would be around detection tools. The bad news is there are not good, reliable detection tools that are available in a really broad way for journalists. I am hesitant to recommend a set of tools. I'll give you, the 1 minute précis on what you might want to think about if you're encountering something. And then I think hand back to the questions, just so we can leave space for that. Really, I encourage this in all my conversations with journalists, is start with where you are in the same way you'd think about journalistic reporting on any other type of potentially fraudulent or fake information, right? So the advantage of many of your news outlets is you're grounded in community, you're thinking about that, right? So source verification, thinking very much also about encouraging in your readership a media literacy that is about, the range of media literacy frameworks. The one I use is the SIFT framework, STOP. investigate the source, find alternative coverage, trace the original, is to really encourage your viewership to be and readership to be not overly skeptical, but to be, to use the same media literacy practices. And for yourself to think, when it comes to one of these pieces of media, a lot of the media I encounter that's claimed to be deep faked is actually shallow faked. It's someone miscontextualizing an existing media. So doing the things that I anticipate you're already doing, like, for example, using a reverse video search, looking for additional content is the first step. Then you might consider then moving to what's considered glitch analysis. This is the looking at a piece of media and seeing if it has visible glitches. I am hesitant to recommend this as a long-term strategy because, in fact, you can't hear this and see this in a really reliable way. But sometimes the media is crappy and you should be able to do that, right? So you should always at least use your common sense. The next stage would be to use tools that enable you to do metadata analysis in a way that looks at that. And the final stage, but I'm not strongly recommending it, is there may be better tools for AI detection available by next year. The problem is that AI detection tools don't tend to generalize well between different ways people create AI products. They often don't detect a manual edit. If someone's using just misedited it, right, just took a bit out of a piece of audio. So that it's very easy to get a false positive or a false negative. And given the public level of education about this and the way people exploit those fears and the is it, isn't it, you should be very careful as the media not to reinforce that by starting to share things and saying, we did this technical analysis if you don't know how to do this. You might want to consider whether there are resources available in your public universities where there often are media forensics experts who might be able to help you.
Thank you, Sam. Sounds like we really need to be well prepared. A lot of our media organizations don't have a lot of resources. So, using resources in public universities and others is a good idea. Okay, we're going to start having just questions thrown out for everyone. Anyone who wants to answer, please answer. The question that comes to mind, we're talking about, protecting election workers, etc. There was a push. I don't know how successful it was by the Republicans to substitute, to elect people who were sympathetic to them. What if, an election official that has for example, a very high position goes rogue and says, and either tries to change the results of the election, tries to do it really in reality, not in the court, the way that they tried to do it in 2020. Are there guardrails for that? And we recognize that every state manages its own election system. So who wants to answer that? Raise your hand, just unmute and go ahead.
I can start talking about it. So since 2020, as election administration has been more politicized, we have seen instances where the bodies that come together to certify election results have declined to certify the results, not for, basically for no good reason, right? Every state does things a little bit differently. Every county does things a little bit differently. But in each of those cases, even some of the cases where the political environment was maybe most favorable to those who were trying to stall the certification of the result for no reason. In each of those cases, it just took a couple of days. In some cases, a court stepped in. The courts are always the backstop for this kind of thing. And for the most part, the courts have behaved admirably in terms of making sure that the proper results are certified in time. If there's no evidence that, leads the court to believe that there's an actual issue. But that's not to say that these holdups, these challenges to election certification don't have an impact on the public's view of elections, because they do. They're still dangerous even when everything is certified according to plan in the end.
Anyone wants to say anything?
I could jump in also and just add that, election officials typically don't have much discretion. Typically, the election laws are very clear about counting votes, what votes count, when you're supposed to certify, and they are just, performing that non-discretionary duty. And therefore, if someone does resist that duty to count everybody's vote and include all those votes in the certified results. There is typically a judicial backstop, like Will says, where perhaps the Secretary of State or the Attorney General can bring a lawsuit requiring the person to carry out their duty.
Thank you so much. And all right, we already have a request here in the chat by one of our colleagues. Hey, we need those resources and techniques. We have done fellowships on this information before. Hopefully we'll be able to do them during this election year. I think it will be very important for ethnic media. Okay, we have some more questions here. You know, the question about thousands of poll workers being needed, and you know, maybe the whole situation contributing to this. Is there anything that we as media can do to help with this? Because I don't really know. I mean, if people don't want to be poll workers, how do we help? Anyone has any suggestions?
One thing you could do is highlight deadline. So the staffers are always, election officers are always looking for volunteer poll workers. I think today we've mixed up in some cases with our language volunteer poll workers and election officials who are hired for the job. But in 2020, actually, there were so many people who wanted to be poll workers that actually many people were turning volunteer poll workers away. I think that's kind of died down, and in 2022, places were looking for more volunteer poll workers, and these volunteers do get paid. Not handsomely, but they do get paid. And you guys could highlight those deadlines to apply to be a poll worker, because in some cases people apply and it turns out you had to apply a month before the election or something like that.
There's also a dearth of non-English poll workers, which means particularly for this audience, if you do highlight the need for poll workers, and on the volunteer side, they do get paid a little bit, as Will said, but it's important to help correct where voters may not know their rights. You can do a piece about the rights that voters have to bring someone into the ballot box with them to help make sense of ballot language. I have, on the lawyer side, worked with voters who have been turned away from the ballot box because workers did not understand the law. The media can help educate people about language barriers that may not even exist. Could encourage people to volunteer to be workers in Spanish or in Vietnamese or another language. There are so many ways your reporting could be the reason voters feel more likely to engage and vote. We are in a climate that by design is discouraging engagement and conversation. People are divided, more calcified than I've ever seen, more anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, bigotry online, and your writing and coverage can help move audiences and readers who might otherwise feel very disconnected.
Thank you, Nora. Because we only have a couple of minutes or maybe even less, I'm gonna give others time to give a last comment. Maybe Gowri, you can go ahead. Last comment, anything you want.
Really just thank you for having me here, and thank you for everyone for reporting on elections and voting and getting accurate information out.
Well, thank you for the work that you do. Nora, you already gave your last. Will?
I always have final words, but don't worry. Please come find me. There was so much that we couldn't touch on. So I would just say, it's so great you're here, and please reach out. I'll put my email here in the chat. I mean, you're doing essential work. So thank you so much.
So are you. Thank you. Will?
Same. Yep. I put my email in the chat. Would love to talk to anybody. Thank you.
Wonderful. Sam?
Nothing further. I'll drop my email in the chat as well.
All right. So, well, thank you everyone for being here. This is just an opening salvo. I think we need to do more about this over this next year, breaking these problems down. I know it was a lot of things in one briefing, but we wanted to give a broad idea of what, the threats were. And we will make sure to focus more in the future on the individual issues. We have time. We'll do it. Thank you for being with us.